Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. As I said, my name is McKinley Thompson. I am the Senior Living Marketing Manager here at Dude Solutions, and I will be your moderator for today's presentation. Before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this session and distributing the slide deck and the recording to you after this presentation concludes. And we will also have a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. So if you have any questions for our speaker, we will go ahead and address those at the end or follow up with you separately if we run out of time. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker today, Josh Malbagat. He is our Director of Senior Living here at Dude Solutions. If you're a client, you've probably worked with him or heard from him. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him and we can get started. Josh? Josh, are you there?
You'd think I've learned after all these years not to mute myself. Thanks, McKinley. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the work that we've been doing with a couple of organizations relative to some of the new CARF requirements around capital needs assessments or facility condition assessments. I'm going to be drawing on information that we've kind of gleaned from the standards, as well as work with a number of senior living communities. So with that, our agenda. So basically, what I thought I'd start with was a little self-assessment for you. A couple questions that you can ask yourself or ask others in your organization if you're not as familiar with some of these items to determine kind of where you sit on the scale of having the data prepared for the requirements, but also for good stewardship of your communities. Then we'll just open up with the actual requirements, take a look at those, then dive into essentially a bunch of acronyms, CNAs, FCAs, PCAs. There's all these different acronyms out there for essentially the same thing. It's the idea of knowing what we have to prepare for from a financial perspective relative to aging buildings, equipment, components, things like that. And we'll touch on those elements. Then we'll talk about why this stuff matters. So what the value of all the work that we do putting into that is. And then look at how we get the job done, or how you can get the job done, essentially where to find data, what you want to look at, some options for doing it in-house versus hiring an outside party to do the work, and then finish up with how do you get the most out of the work that you do or the work that you hire someone to do, both short term, so looking at the immediate data that we're collecting, but also long term. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is looking at more of a multi-dimensional view when it comes to the idea of capital planning, looking not just at the forecast information, but also integrating some operational data into this to be able to see, more detailed, how are we making repair versus replace decisions as the capital plan becomes real. We might project something out saying we need to do this in 10 years, but how do we actually decide whether that's year 9, year 11, or within year 10, which items do we actually replace? We're going to touch on some reporting that we've looked at to help determine that. So without further ado, the self-assessment side. So here, think of these questions as a guidepost to see where you sit. I've been working with communities now for, let's just say, over 15 years, and the spread of where people sit is very vast. But when we're starting out looking at the idea of a capital needs assessment or a facility condition assessment, you want to look at first, where do you sit now? Do you have a complete list of your equipment? And by that, I'm not just talking about, hey, I've got 5 air handling units. It's, when did you buy them? How much did you pay for them? What's the remaining life on them? What are the failure risks that we have on these in terms of assets that we might basically have had in the community since we built 20 years ago and we've just left them running. What are the risks of those things failing early or late if we're already past the expiration date? Do you have a plan for which assets should be replaced when and what the replacement costs are? You know, how far out does it go? I work with lots of communities that have 1-2 year time horizons. That's really not going to be sufficient for a long-term view for the standard requirements. We need to be looking out much further. Ideally, we're talking 20 years. And then talking internally about how do you make repair versus replace decisions? You know, are you looking at the percent of the purchase cost that you spend on repairs, or are you basing things more on a gut feel? I worked with one group where when we were talking about, you know, when things needed to be replaced, the reference points were things like, well, our DON was pregnant with her second kid and he's now 9 years old. So I guess we did that about 10 years ago. You know, it's looking at, do you have real data for making these decisions, for making these plans? And then finally, do you know what your maintenance backlog is or your deferred maintenance? What are the things that maybe you've chosen over time not to do because there wasn't enough money or it wasn't a priority at the time? We want to be keeping track of those items and actually have a list. So if you've got that, that's a great check mark. Now, going through this list with organizations, I find huge opportunities here. We now work with, I'd say, almost, I think maybe over 1,000 senior living communities or organizations. And what we find is people get really excited about software. They dive in, they get great at managing work orders, they're doing their preventative maintenance. But when it comes time to building up their asset data, building out the capital plan, those who try to do the data collection on their own, about 90% of them stall out after adding 30 to 60 assets, and 50% of people have 0 assets entered into their system. I use that just as a data point. I know we have some folks here who aren't using the software, but I'm sure that holds true across kind of the industry, if you will. Most organizations do not have true asset lists. And for that purpose, just to clarify, I am excluding from this the depreciation tables that the finance department has. Those typically are very high level. Many organizations have those. They do not fulfill the requirement, though, of having a forecast and a capital plan. Just because something is depreciated on the books does not mean it's replaced. And just because something has a forecasted depreciation life of 10 years does not mean that we're going to get 10 years out of it. So here I'm really talking about a true asset list that the facilities and the finance team are using to manage the repair tracking and the future replacement dates. Looking at some general studies, if I look at life plan or CCRC communities, under 10% have reported having a 20-year capital plan in studies that I've seen. And then the other reality is that when I talk with executive directors or corporate regional directors, they're typically leaving it up to maintenance to manage this. And the reason for failure, and what I'm defining failure is 90% of people not having their assets in there, and only 10% having that 20-year capital plan is really a lack of time. We already have full-time jobs, and trying to collect all this information can really drown someone. And honestly, a lack of expertise. When we look at forecasting the remaining life of items, roof inspections, boilers, things like that, that's an architecture engineer level expertise typically, especially as you get into some of the deeper and larger expenses. Our facilities teams, well, we hire them to do a great job managing the building, forecasting things, and they have some of the expertise, but in many places don't have all the expertise needed. So there's lots of opportunity there. And that just sets the stage for what the actual requirements are. So capital planning overall is something that any organization should be doing. It's essential to our long-term success. No one wants to hit the CFO up with a surprise request for $250,000 to replace a roof in the next year. We want to be looking ahead. relative to CARF and the type of standards that they're building in, they basically put that into the requirements. And that makes great sense because they're talking about the viability and sustainability of the community. So the first requirement, it's I think 1F19 section there, basically says that the organization needs to conduct a capital needs assessment that addresses the existing capital assets, so looking at what equipment we have now, that existing inventory, and then our future asset needs. So that involves both planned expansions, but also the replacement of those. Of course, it needs to be documented, something that we can have that's transferable, and I think this is something that a lot of organizations stall out on, needs to be reviewed regularly and updated as needed. I see a lot of organizations that spend a bunch of money and have an assessment done or do a big job themselves, and then it sits on a shelf and it doesn't really get touched. The number of times that I've seen the dust get blown off the report when we go to talk about it, well, I don't have enough hands to count. So that's part of the whole process here, is creating something that you're reviewing regularly. Now, what is regularly defined as? It's something that each organization gets to determine, but best practice I've found is we want to look, of course, each year at what has changed and keep things updated, but dig deeper, maybe on a 3-year cycle into what has really happened from an asset replacement perspective. What changes do we see coming, and keep things updated. Now, if we dig deeper into the requirements, and this is one of the things I love about the CARF requirements, is the intent statement, an explanation of what we're actually trying for here. I wish that some of the CMS, life safety, NFPA standards were written out this way. But what this gives us basically is, why does this matter? What is it we're looking for? And we're going to share this PowerPoint. You can read over all of those things. If I drill it down, though, into what it actually means, what it boils down to, we need to know what we have. We need to know what it costs to replace it. And we have to have the dollars set aside, or a plan to fund the dollars required and keep it updated. So we need to be driving through essentially that, get the inventory, assess the assets, reserve funds for it, create a capital reserve, and keep it updated. The areas of focus. Now this, when we talk about a capital needs assessment or a facility condition assessment, I'm going to talk more about the differences there in a minute. You can go pretty broad, you can get a little more focused. The way that I interpret it is really we're looking at the capital assets, both the property, the plant, and the equipment, bricks and mortar, the HVAC, sometimes landscaping for some communities. And then for each of those items, we want to be looking at when it was put into service. What's the repair replacement date? What's the cost of that? In addition, deferred maintenance becomes part of this, because we're usually not doing everything that, well, we've planned to do or technically needs to be done because of conflicting priorities. So we want to build that in. So those different acronyms that I was talking about, CNA, PCA, FCA, there's even other terms for it. All boils down to essentially the same thing at different degrees, though, different depths of focus. A PCA is a property condition assessment. Generally, that's used when a property changes hands. So when someone's acquiring something, there might be a more cursory look at assets. It doesn't really detail into a detailed list of assets or anything like that. Certainly doesn't really dig into deferred maintenance. Then you've got the capital needs assessment, which is kind of the base requirement there. And that's something that is more financial based. And then you've got the facility condition assessment that covers all the financial pieces really on the capital needs side, but also gets into a more detailed asset view. And the reason that I focus on this FCA piece is because with the facility condition assessment, what we're getting into is the actual equipment that we have, where it is, and by tracking it at that equipment level, we can start to get into repair versus replace decisions being fed off of operational data, because we can track the repair cost of an asset and then use that to guide future decision making. So within that, when we talk about the FCA, I'm going to use that abbreviation going forward, it's basically an analysis of the condition of your building and equipment. So we're talking about the asset detail, the current condition, the deferred maintenance, remaining life, replacement costs, all of those items built in. When we get into this, we talk about why do we need to do this work. There's a couple of key value points that I want to pull out here. Number one, large unexpected expenses hurt. I've seen it happen to organizations where they've had those surprise $150,000, $200,000, $300,000 expenses, and they cause some hard choices on what you're going to do and where to find the dollars. So our FCA gives us clarity on what's coming. Number two, of course, it fulfills the accreditation requirements, 1F 19 to 21. So we need to have it. And then number three, and I think perhaps this long-term is the most important one, the property and the assets that sometimes we think about as things on a spreadsheet or lines of code, that's our residents' homes. We need to be good stewards of what we're doing with the community overall and how it's going to require care and upkeep. So there's some other reasons. Gives us visibility on what's coming, helps us optimize our financial performance from the perspective of knowing how we want to plan for things. If you've got 150 air handling unit or fan coil units, knowing what your replacement cycles are coming up can give you the opportunity to batch things together more, do more bulk purchases, negotiate better prices if we know what's coming. Helps us with that planning for the future. Reduces compliance risk overall. If we're actually taking care of our equipment and budgeting for and replacing it as needed, we have less emergencies come up, which in turn improves efficiency and finally improves resident satisfaction because stuff isn't breaking for them. Things look good, they're kept up. And then creates a sustainable future. If we don't know what's coming, there are risks financially to being able to sustain what we're committed to. So from an actual execution perspective, when I look at this, you've got kind of two paths, if you will. You can go down the self-service path or an expert-driven path. If you have the resources, this is something that, technically according to the requirements, you could do on your own. There's a couple of things on the self-service side that I like to highlight. We're talking about low cost because you're doing it yourself. So that's a check mark. The time has to be there though, so there's a lot of effort involved. And for many organizations, that's where this kind of suffers, the time investment and the effort. The expertise side, there's always a question mark on that. Depending on the experience of the team that you have there, you might have it. You might not, so I put that as a question mark. When you go down the expert path, there is a higher cost because we're bringing in outside people. So when I'm comparing the two on the balance, that's something we have to factor in. There's a higher cost to get experts in. We're talking about typically architect, engineer level people coming out to do an assessment on the building. They're walking through, they're getting up on the roof, they're taking pictures, they're talking with the teams. So there's more work there that's outsourced and has a cost, but lower effort on your part. So it's something that both from a time and effort perspective is much faster. One of the things that I've really seen works well is the kind of pre-site questions. They identify some of the issues in advance and then come through and work with the teams at the site. And then finally, the expertise. That's what we're paying for, so we certainly have that. Now, if you do choose to do something like this on your own, you want to make sure that you're realistic in what you're doing. So number one, you've got to set time aside to collect and appraise the assets and the building components. So for people who are using the Works Hub, we have our capital planning application, which is an option on the software. It integrates in with the work order management piece. And what you can do there is build your asset list into the system and build into that an appraisal on the software, basically what's the remaining life, what's its condition, and set up your building components. If you build that in, the software will create your capital plan for you. But you need to be prepared to invest the time in both actually collecting the data, but also researching replacement costs and inflation factors. You need to think about where you're going to find that data. It can mean calling manufacturers. It can mean looking up what you paid for something earlier. Just make sure that if you do this yourself, you start to get into looking at what do these things cost now. If it's something that you bought 20 years ago and it's a major building component, maybe a boiler, air handling units, things like that, get yourself some more accurate quotes on what replacement would cost now, because what we paid 20 years ago, it's not going to be the same now. So that's where, it does require significant time and has a risk of missing elements, but you can take that on. If you go the expert-driven route, there's a couple of highlights there. And this is what I've, of course, worked mainly with people on. This is what we've got partners to provide. Essentially, they'll come out and do the identification and recording of the condition of the assets and the building components. They'll create the 20-year capital reserve tables and the systems and components with the replacement costs. They've got the expert skills. One of the things that I think is really interesting that they bring is realistic estimates on cost. So they've built up databases on what these things cost to replace based on their years of experience. They also come in with the deferred maintenance view. So looking at what things should be done now but haven't been done. It's easy for us to suffer from boiled frog syndrome, where we miss something, we forget about it, then it just becomes part of the day-to-day, and we're just used to it. We don't have that fresh eye view. So they come in and build that out, and then follow it up with a full narrative report with the description of everything that they're talking about, with pictures and all those things. Another value on the outsourced side or the expert side is that they are a neutral third party. I've worked with a number of maintenance directors who have wanted to replace certain items and haven't been able to get a board or a home office to sign off on it. By having the third party that's neutral say, hey, here's really what needs to be happening, that can really help drive the attention to where those dollars should be spent. So, you've got two paths there. If you do go down the path of doing it yourself, the Works Hub has built into it the capital planning piece where you can fill out the key information and it'll create those reports. Just make sure that you're setting aside enough time and you're realistic about where you're going to find that. And if you go the expert path, well, there we have partners that we work with that will actually come out and do that work and load the data directly into the Works Hub for you so that it's all integrated. And then with the software side, it's actually set up so that you can maintain it yourself. And that's where we get into the idea of how do we keep this up to date, that requirement that we're reassessing these plans. I've worked with groups where they have a group come out, an outside contractor, that third party come out every 3 years and do a review of the plan. My view on that is you're probably overpaying for a service side. If we can set up the software so that it has all of these items in it, and you're managing the assets from the perspective of adding new ones you purchase in and retiring ones that you've retired, and you're updating your capital plan with a couple of key things, and I'll show you that in a bit, you can keep this up to date yourself once the big grunt work is done of loading everything and getting these initial assessments. When you buy a new asset, it comes with an anticipated lifespan. A lot easier to set that up from the beginning. So I seek folks who do this well, going with an expert to do the initial assessment, and then over the next 6-7 years being able to update that themselves and absolutely fulfill that requirement. So this is where then we get into that idea of, once we've got a plan, we've built it out, how do we connect this to the operational side? And typically what I see happen here is you've got your capital plan over on this left side here, which says what I have to do when I have to do it. And then you've got some operational data, or for sites who don't have software, the memory of what's happened over on the right. And these are completely separate. We don't feed the history of repairs into our capital plan in terms of using that data to guide when something needs to be replaced. So my capital plan might say I have 10 air handling units that have to be replaced. Maybe I can only afford to do 4. How do I decide, what the actual case is of how many do I actually need to replace? Is it 4? Is it 6? Is it 3? The operational data is separate. We don't connect them, and that results in really a wish list for the capital plan. Facilities team going to a CFO or a COO or the board with a wish list. And then the CFO or the board becoming essentially like Santa Claus, granting wishes, a wish master, if you will, looking at, okay, what could I do? What we like to bring to this is a more multifaceted view, where we're integrating the capital plan with the operational data to give a solid plan. So when we go to make a capital request, we have the capital plan that says, here's what our plan was. That's our guidepost, essentially where things are heading. And then I've got the operational data so that I can say, yes, our capital plan said we had to replace these 15 things this year for $200,000. And here's the performance of those assets and which ones we should be paying particular attention to if we don't have the funds. Looking at that repair versus replace, which ones have we spent more than a certain percentage of the purchase cost in repairs? So now I'm going to share with you a couple of shots from the software. I know a lot of folks here are already using the Works Hub. So what I've pulled up here is an asset record. This is looking at our actual equipment. So this is when you go into the program and load in an asset. These are the fields that you can fill in. This is the stuff that we fill in for you if we're doing it. But essentially, we're looking at things like the tag number so we can identify the asset, a model number so we can search for, or you can search for repair, replacement parts, things like that. Serial number, key for warranty tracking, recalls, that type of thing. Where it is, so that we can actually find it. The manufacturer, description, what is it? The category so that we can report on it, group things together, HVAC, boiler, things like that. And then we also add in a barcode. We are huge proponents of barcoding your assets so that you can log repairs against them. I find that sites that don't have assets barcoded or don't use the barcodes end up not having the repair history on the asset, which then prevents us from being able to actually use the operational data to guide the immediate replacement decisions. And then you've got this stuff here, purchase date, purchase cost, fantastic for new assets, gives us the idea of essentially how old is this, and if we were doing our own capital plan, if we're filling this information in, that'll create our first assessment to give us an idea of when we need to replace it. So that's my key data. Now, when you're doing this, you do want to decide how deep to go. I've worked with groups where they've gone down to the level of inventorying furniture, and I'm talking like tables and chairs in the dining room. From a capital plan perspective, you may want to build that in. I'm not a proponent of building in every individual table and chair, though. Those are things where I would add them as a generic line item, because chances are, if you're going to be replacing them, you're probably doing a refresh on that area overall, so you'll be doing some more significant work, not doing them on one-offs. So Then you've got the capital plan side. So this is where we get into being able to assess the assets. On the previous slide here, when a new asset is in, I'm putting in that data, purchase date, purchase cost, estimated lifespan, and that creates for me my first assessment that says, hey, here's when you have to replace that item. The software that we have then allows you to do assessments. So if you do this on your own, if you're not a client of the Works Hub, not using the software, you can build in a spreadsheet and start to do your own assessments. Just make sure you keep it up to date and only let one person edit it, because you get multiple people into a spreadsheet with no accountability and it can be a nightmare. But you're putting this in and you're looking at how do things change over time. So when you do it yourself, you add a line for a midterm adjustment. If we're setting it up for you, we're importing all those items. But that creates for you the assessment for the individual item. And that comes through with a comparison to the original estimate, the new requirement, assessing that relative to the costs, comparisons, red light, green light on asset performance, things like that, all coming in. So that's the basis of the capital plan. And then from here, then we drive into the actual reports. These are the types of things that organizations are looking for when they start to do their planning. You can do high level, where we look at essentially by category, what is our spend forecasted to be? And this is indexed to inflation, so it's giving us an idea of what's coming. I can drill deeper into by an asset subcategory, so I can group things together, so I can see, okay, how many air handling units do we have? What's the dollar spend on that? Or I can even drill into a per asset detail level. Now, if you were doing this yourself, it's this per asset detail level that you need for both the kind of, well, being a good steward on the planning and the requirements. We've got to have that detail there. We just add extra things to roll it up and give different views to be able to actually, batch things together, make bigger plans for the future, that type of thing. Now we've got the repair versus replace decision making. So on this side, we've done the capital plan, we've gone through, we've got that data in place. Let's say it's the next year, it's time to plan for what we're going to actually replace. Maybe it's 4 years from now. This is where we want to integrate the operational data and the capital plan data. So using our capital planning piece, we look at our report and we see, hey, I need to replace these 15 things. We find out, hey, we don't have money for all of that. What are we going to do? Well, if we were logging the repair history into a system and had that ability to report on what we had spent per asset, we would be able to guide that repair versus replace decision making in the short term. So coming here, here's the type of report that we're pulling out. We've got this idea of what are all the items that we have. So this is just my sample report with a dishwasher, generator, and a water heater. And what have I actually spent in repairs? So what percent of the purchase cost have I spent in repairs? There's different ways that you can roll this up. I'm of the opinion that we want to roll in our internal costs as well. I see lots of organizations that don't track labor time on assets. I like to see something where we're logging all of the repairs that are done externally, but then also rolling, and the costs, but also rolling in any internal repairs that we've done with the time spent and pulling off of that time and a labor cost or an hourly rate to calculate a labor cost of maintaining that asset, whether it's internal or external. So I roll those together here. When we look at this, the total cost of maintenance is this column. I can also see the total time. Now, when you're doing this yourself in the software, we basically do the smart things like exclude from that all the preventative maintenance time that's been spent on it, things like that, because that's a fixed cost, whether it's a new asset or an old asset. If you're going to track this on your own, you do want to be careful and make sure that you're differentiating those two and tracking that info. Because this is what then you couple with the submission for the capital request. You've got the capital plan saying, hey, here are the things. Then you've got this saying, here are the things where we're spending good money after bad if we keep investing in repairs here. You might use that, though, as a case to say, actually, in this case, and this is where the operational data comes in, we've just overhauled this item. So we want to reset our expectations here because we expect to get more life out of it. So we might revise those. So all in all, from the perspective of a capital needs assessment or a facility condition assessment, the idea is we need to know those base data points of what do we have, what condition is it in, what's it going to cost to replace it or repair it. We're going to fund those items. And then what we highly recommend layering into that is the operational view of what has the spend been on that asset so that we can make better decisions as we move forward. So I wanted to keep this one short because I think that the essence of this is it's a job. Pretty basic when it comes down to what the requirements are, but it does take a lot of time and requires some expertise. So that's the conclusion of my formal presentation. Would like to open it up to questions if anyone has. There is a chat box in the webinar tool there so that you can post questions. McKinley, do we have any questions coming in?
Hey, Josh. Yes, we do actually already have a question, and I'm also going to launch a poll up here in case anybody would like to follow up with you. But our first question is, Josh, do you have templates available for major manufacturers' equipment or major assets?
Yeah. So, well, I shouldn't say yeah. The answer is no. I don't have templates set up in the software right now in terms of, if I purchased model GE XYZ, here's what the remaining or the forecasted life should be. That's not something that we've undertaken. We've looked over the years at, does it make sense to try to integrate something with an RS means type database, which can give us that information. But in talking with our partners who actually come out and do a lot of the FCA type stuff, we've got a lot of feedback on the variability of those expenses and how it's really hard to predict. So we've chosen to not put in information that might lead you down a bad path. Open it up, though, that you're able to add your own.
Awesome. Do you know about how much time it takes to do an FCA in-house using our own resources? Can you give us an idea of that?
Well, it's really tough to say based on, size of building, scope, is it vertical, is it spread out, what level are we going to? So it's really tough for me to give you a hard number, but here's what I would say. When I send people out who are experts and do this as their full-time job, this is what they do. They're doing anywhere from on-site 30,000 to 50,000 square feet a day. When I've had people do this themselves, just on the data collection side, they're running closer to 15 to 20,000 square feet of space per day, so about half that. And then there's all of the work after the fact where you're assessing the asset, looking at pictures you might have taken, putting in remaining life. researching what the replacement cost should be, those types of things. I've found that, that could be another 3-4 days per 50,000 square feet. But if you don't have any of the expertise, or you're searching for a lot of the information, it goes up from there. Awesome. That's a really vague answer, I'm sorry, but it's hard to say without knowing the size of the campus.
Yeah, no problem. We have another question, actually. Someone wants to know, does the Works Hub have the same asset tracking and planning features as the School Dude and Facility Dude software systems?
So they're different. I'm not an expert on capital forecast. That's our sister product that's been designed really for the school environment. What I understand that it's been designed around is more of a modeling methodology, where using like thousands and thousands and thousands of schools that they work with, they've created models around specific performance benchmarking. We don't follow the same criteria within the Works Hub. So I'd say that they're pretty different in terms of how they operate, but the end result is essentially the same. We're looking at the forecasts on capital requirements for asset purchases.
Perfect. We have another question. If we wanted to do an FCA through your company, how soon would we expect to get started and have a final product? And do you barcode assets while you're out there?
Thank you. That's actually a great point. I don't think I mentioned that. So typical timelines, we're looking at, I would say 8 to 12 weeks from start to finish. Big kind of indicator on that, whether it's closer to the 8-week or the 12-week point, is both what information is available at the start and how quickly you can get some basic questionnaires filled out, and the size of the campus. Larger campuses are going to take more time than smaller. In terms of the barcoding piece, absolutely. When we come out, because we believe that barcoding is essential to being able to log the repairs against the assets, we just build into the process the barcoding of the assets so that when a maintenance person has a repair on an asset, instead of someone having to search for it and connect it, when they walk up to that asset, they can tap a scan barcode button, scan that barcode, that'll link that asset on, and it's now part of the history. Any of the repairs done are right there for them.
Awesome. We have another question. Are all features of the Capital Asset Platform available to current customers of the Works Hub?
So capital planning is an optional module, so it wouldn't be there for folks who have just the standard maintenance component of the Works Hub. We've basically taken the approach with the software of trying to keep the base entry fee as low as possible so that people don't pay for features they aren't interested in or aren't going to use right at the start. Capital planning is one of the lower cost modules. It's relative to maintenance, not a significant cost at all. But it wouldn't be something that if you're not licensed for it, you would see. For that person, if you reach out to us, we can give you, a quick estimate on the cost. It takes like 2 minutes to give you that.
Perfect. I'm going to give a second for anyone else to have any questions. Someone did ask, will the slides be available for registrants? Absolutely. We're going to send you the deck and the recording within 24 hours of the event's conclusion. So please look for those in your inbox and let us know if you don't receive those. We'll make sure to get them to you. With that, do you have examples of the final product someone would like to know, Josh, that is available for people who are on the fence maybe?
Yeah, well, absolutely. If they reach out to us, we can get them samples.
Perfect. Well, with that, it looks like we don't have any more questions, but we will be following up with you if you answered one of our poll questions. And as I said, we will get you a recording and slide deck. But Josh, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We look forward to having you join us again in the future.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.